At 9:27 in the morning on March 24, 2015, an Airbus A320 checked in with air traffic control in Marseille. The aircraft was operating as Germanwings Flight 9525, flying from Barcelona to Düsseldorf, and there was nothing unusual about the exchange. 3 minutes later, the captain confirmed his clearance to the next waypoint along the route. For a few more minutes, everything continued as expected. Then the picture changed. Controllers in Marseille noticed the jet's altitude sliding toward 30,000 feet, nearly 2,000 feet below where it should have been cruising, and still dropping. They radioed the crew to ask what altitude they'd been cleared to fly. Silence. Half a minute later, they tried again. Still nothing. A few minutes after that, they switched to another frequency, hoping for a response. None came. For the next several minutes, Marseille Control kept trying, cycling through frequencies, pulling in a French military air traffic controller and even another aircraft in the area to attempt contact. Every attempt failed. By 9:40, radar contact with the plane was gone entirely, and French authorities declared a distress phase, the formal signal that a flight and everyone aboard it were considered to be in grave danger. A minute later, Germanwings Flight 9525 struck a mountainside in the French Alps. The location of the crash made the recovery effort brutally difficult. With no road access to the site, rescue workers had to be flown in by helicopter, and what they found was devastation on a scale that made identification nearly impossible in the moment. The aircraft had been torn into small fragments spread across a wide stretch of terrain. Investigators recovered both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder within days, though both had sustained heavy damage. As analysts began piecing together what the recordings held, a deeply unsettling picture took shape. This had not been an accident, and it had not been the work of outside hijackers. It was something else entirely. To understand what happened, it helps to rewind to the moment the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Shortly after 9:30, the captain stepped out of the cockpit to use the lavatory. Almost as soon as he left, the aircraft's altitude was reprogrammed for a steep descent from inside the cockpit itself. When the captain returned a few minutes later and tried to get back in, he found the door locked against him. Standing outside, unable to enter, he began to realize what was happening. His first officer had taken control of the plane, and there was no way for him to get back inside. The cockpit doors on aircraft like this one had been redesigned after 2001 specifically to keep unauthorized people out following a hijacking. Under normal circumstances, a crew member outside the cockpit calls in on an intercom and enters a code, prompting a buzzer inside. The pilot then flips a switch to unlock the door. There's also a backup system. An emergency code crew can enter if they're worried about the people inside the cockpit, which starts a timer and unlocks the door automatically after 30 seconds unless someone inside overrides it. And that's the critical detail. Whoever is inside the cockpit can flip that same switch to lock, blocking every method of entry, including the emergency override. It's a safeguard built for exactly one scenario: someone trying to force their way in during a hijacking. The first officer used that same switch to seal the captain out completely while the plane continued descending toward the mountains. With the captain locked outside and no way back in, the cockpit voice recorder captured the sound of him slamming against the door in the final minutes, trying desperately to break through. The doors had been reinforced precisely to resist that kind of force, built to withstand an armed intruder, and there was nothing he could do. In those last moments, the passengers, the cabin crew, and the captain all understood that the aircraft was going down. There were no survivors. The crash killed 144 passengers, 4 flight attendants, and both pilots. Among those on board was an entire class of school students returning home from an exchange trip in Spain. The captain, Patrick Sondheimer, was 34 years old and a father of 2 young children. His wife later established a foundation in his memory dedicated to helping children cope with grief and crisis. He had logged thousands of flight hours over his career, and in his final minutes he had been fighting to get back into the cockpit to save the aircraft and everyone on it. The first officer was 27. He had wanted to fly since childhood. His room was reportedly decorated with posters of aircraft and airline branding, and he'd trained as a glider pilot in his teens before going straight into Lufthansa's flight academy after finishing school. But not long into that training, he paused it. He was going through a severe depressive episode, was placed on antidepressant medication, and spent an extended period under psychiatric care. Eventually, doctors cleared him, declaring the episode in remission, and after several months his student pilot license and medical certification were reinstated. With one condition: if he needed psychiatric treatment again, he would be grounded. He pressed on with training, but hit a snag when he needed to complete paperwork for the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration in order to train at a Lufthansa-affiliated flight school in Arizona. On that form, he stated he had never been diagnosed with a mental health condition. It wasn't true, and it was discovered. Falsifying that kind of federal document can end a pilot's career or worse, but the FAA opted to give him another chance. He disclosed his history of depression and was allowed to continue to Arizona. By 2013, he had joined Germanwings, the budget carrier owned by Lufthansa. About a year later, his depression resurfaced. This time it took an unusual form. He became convinced he was losing his eyesight, seeing flashes, halos, and streaks of light, and began seeing eye doctors and neurologists repeatedly each week. Medical scans turned up nothing to explain it. His family doctor eventually diagnosed him with a hypochondriacal disorder alongside what was described as an emerging psychotic episode, and recommended he seek treatment at a psychiatric clinic. He didn't go. Instead, in January 2015, he returned to the psychiatrist who had treated him years earlier, began psychotherapy, and started taking a stronger course of antidepressants, all while continuing to work and fly. Between February and March, he collected multiple medical notes from different doctors excusing him from work. Something in his life clearly wasn't right, and it seems he wanted a way out of it. 4 days before the crash, he searched online for information about how the cockpit door locking system on the A320 worked. On the outbound leg from Düsseldorf to Barcelona that same day as the crash, he briefly adjusted the descent settings while Sondheimer had stepped out, seemingly a test. On the return flight to Düsseldorf, he used that same knowledge to bring the plane down for good. How does something like this happen? Commercial pilots undergo regular physical checkups, but mental health assessment is far less rigorous, and much of it depends on pilots honestly reporting their own condition. That system relies on trust, and in this case, that trust broke down. A pilot who had been declared unfit to work simply didn't tell his employer. There is a legal mechanism for doctors to break patient confidentiality if someone poses a danger to public safety, but none of the doctors who treated him or signed off on his sick leave took that step. Whether they believed he was a risk to himself but not to others, whether they feared the professional and legal consequences of breaching confidentiality, or whether Germany's strong cultural emphasis on medical privacy played a role, is something that remains genuinely unresolved, a question probably better suited to ethicists and healthcare policy experts than to a video essay. What is clear is that an event like this remains extraordinarily rare. In its aftermath, European aviation regulators pushed through a series of safety reforms, including expanded psychological evaluation for pilots, and many airlines adopted a rule requiring 2 authorized crew members in the cockpit at all times. Though some carriers, including Lufthansa, have since dropped that requirement. Germanwings itself was folded into the Eurowings brand later in 2015, rebranding that had actually been planned before the crash occurred. Lufthansa ultimately paid compensation to the victims' families, though for many, no amount of compensation could address what they had lost.